thank the Institute for having invited me to this interesting conference, and especially Natalia Mićunović, who was very kind in the correspondence we had before this conference. Now, my topic has actually been anticipated by the speakers before me. Professor Bašić was speaking about the ambivalence of national construction, about the ambivalent historical role of nation, and colleague Milisavljević was pointing out that today contemporary nationalism is different, it's specific, it is defensive, as opposed to the messianic nationalism, as Professor Perniat says. So let me just state my hypothesis, which I'm going to present. My hypothesis is that contemporary nationalism is a transformation of the traditional nationalism we know from the 19th century. It is a transformation that is triggered by internal contradictions of the traditional nationalism. And that maybe, that's another hypothesis, maybe, or subaltern hypothesis, maybe we should now speak about identity communities instead of nations. Because nations were actually a kind of emancipatory constructions. They were fighting against empires, Ottoman Empire, Habsburg Empire, Romanov Empire. So nationalism was very important in anti-colonial struggles in the 20th century. So it was progressive. It has an emancipatory potential. This potential was limited, of course. And, well, let me say it was bourgeois type of emancipation, but still, if compared with the imperial constructions of colonial oppressions, it was progressive. Nowadays, it's different. So my theory is that internal contradictions of the classical or traditional nationalism have triggered processes which, in conjunction with other processes which initially have no connection with the nationalist construction, produced what we are speaking about today and tomorrow about the new forms of nationalism. The superficial, or intuitively speaking, the characteristics of new forms of nationalism are populism, which means rejection of the established political constructions, rejection of liberal democracy, and in Europe, rejection of European Union. Authoritarianism, which is creeping extension of the powers of the executive within the limits of liberal democracy, and sometimes breaking out of those limits. And the ruling party apparatus enters into the political field besides the parliamentary procedure. And identity politics, whose most prominent part is anti-immigrant policies. Now, one of the first questions I will put is anti-European Union politics. Does it mean that this new nationalism wants to establish national economy again? But that's a question I will approach later. So, well, this was covered by speakers up to now. It's, you know, when we say nation state, which one do we mean? Is that a 1789 program? Is it 1848, etc.? Or when we say system of states, which one? 19th century, 20th century, 21st century. So we have to be more precise in our terms. Now, My thesis is linked to the historical contingency, which means that the new nationalism is an outcome of a plurality of heterogeneous processes. And it's not programmed in the logic of any of them. It's the result of what Althusser in the early 80s called encounter. Historiography was doing it all the time. That the heterogeneous processes result in results, lead to results that were not programmed in any of them. And Althusser made a philosophy out of it, calling it materialism of the encounter, which means the encounter could have not occurred and nothing in the elements involved prefigured the result. But retroactively we can see the causal determination, the causal link. I would, at the first glance, I would say there are the processes that produced new nationalism are the demise of the triad-centered capitalism, of the American hegemonic capitalism, the last cycle, the American cycle, which was characterized by the hegemony of Euro-Atlantic region plus Japan, Australia, New Zealand. So, as a response to the demise of this type of capitalism, which entered crisis in the mid-70s, new regimes of capital accumulation were proposed or practiced. They were called at the beginning Toyotism or post-Fordism, which means new types of organization of the firm, of capitalist firm. Then another very important process is the restoration of capitalism in post-socialist countries. The institutional establishment of European Union, of Eurozone, of the euro, of the common money, common currency, and the 2008 economic crisis. We have two evident results of this, of those processes in the center, or the ex-center of world global capitalism. One is Brexit, the other is Mr. Trump's presidency, which are definitely a break, a non-traditional event in the history of Euro-Atlantic capitalism. So I will now focus down on the post-socialist process. In 1989 and 1990, the nationalist ideology of post-socialist countries, or the countries that were just breaking away from their socialist past, seemed a replay of the ideology of the Spring of the Nations of the 1848. Now let's look at the ideology of 48. This is a splendid example. Chandra Petöfi song. You have all is here. On your feet now, Hungary calls you. Now is the moment. It's a good translation, by the way. Nothing stalls you. Shall we be slaves or men set free? That is the question. Answer me. It's urgency, you know. And you have this pathos of liberation. The yoke of slavery, no more we shall wear. So I could quote Polish songs, Serbian, Slovenian, whatever. But this one I choose for the purpose because Spring of the Nations. Now in Budapest they seized the printing house, and what did they print? 12 points of their revendications and this poem. And what were the points of the reivindications? The first one was freedom of the press, abolishment of censorship, which means nation is liberal. It's, you know, it's no state religion, equality, civil equality, what was later called civil rights. So it was against feudal monarchical construction and for the freedom and equality. Okay. Now, Friedrich Engels had a very nuanced view of those events in 48. He said, well, first there was this great uprising of all those nations in the Habsburg Empire: Germans, Magyars, Czechs, Poles, Moravians, Slovaks, Croats, Ruthenians, Romanians, Illyrians, and Serbs. Croats here figure twice as Croats and as Illyrians, but came into conflict with one another. That's a national construction. And within each of these nations there was class struggle. But then he said, out of this chaos, a clear picture arose. And the new nations divided into camps. Magyars and Poles and Germans took the side of revolution. All the others were reactionary, became reactionary. And who supported Austrian reaction? The Croats and Slovenes. So, and here you have the leader of the reactionary troops marching against the Hungarian Revolution, Ban, Josip Jelačić. And Marx commented, the real Pan-Slavic Congress are the troops of Jelačić marching against the revolution. And this is the historical replay. That's the Guard of Honor of the President of Croatia, which was established by the first president of independent Croatian state, Franjo Tudjman, in the same costume as Jelačić counter-revolutionary soldiers. So what we have to do is that 19th century nation, the paradigm is concept of nations, which means a hope, a promise of a kind of harmonic coexistence of nations. Humboldt, you know, every nation is particular, but they are all set into a universal frame of the humanity, and everybody contributes something to this universal humanity horizon. Politics of recognition nowadays, Charles Taylor. Each identity group needs recognition, but somebody above, you know, by European Union, by State Department, I don't know. It's a completely different situation. Active notion of human rights. We want freedom of expression because we have something to express. Nowadays, you will speak about it. It's different. It's passive notion of human rights. It's hypochondriac notion of human rights. Everybody's going, looks where my rights are violated, even though they don't have much to tell, to express, or whatever. Messianic arguments in the 19th century, you know, every nation is opening a horizon of a completely new history of humanity. Now, defensive arguments. We are all in danger. Those migrants, we don't know. Terrorists, they're infiltrating, etc. So it's this hypochondriac defensive identity argument that makes those new constructions very dangerous. Not only to the outsiders, but also to the insiders. In the 19th century, people were speaking about national consciousness. Nowadays, we are speaking about identity. So it's a different thing. Identity is essentialist. National consciousness is something that you know, is a presupposition for something better, something you will do. So I will skip this semiotical part because you can show that saying I am a Serb, a Magyar, a Pole in the 19th century had a different semiotic construction than saying the same utterance today. But I would point to this, that national language is, you know, the quintessence of 19th century nation. It also demonstrates the contradiction of national construction. On one side, national language is standardized, which means it's normative. You have to learn it. It's not open to everybody. You have to go at least to elementary school. It has to be acquired. That means an educational system, an ideological state apparatus. It is based on high literary canon, which means it possesses a tremendous discriminatory potential about which Bourdieu was speaking. And it's nurtured by a specialized professional group which establishes literary producers into a quasi-priestly group, writers and domestic linguists. I speak about domestic linguists, not theoretical linguists. So all those contradictions are absolutely transparent in a political decision that was taken in 1850 in Vienna, and which established what was later called Serbo-Croatian language, which is today under attack. So I will not enter this. I will only show you the original text, which is written in a nice archaic language. I will show you the culprits. You recognize Vuk Karadžić with Fes, and Danicic, the translator of Old Testament into Serbo-Croatian. And here is the agent of the Habsburg court, the greatest Slavist of his time, Slovenian, Franz Miklušić, rector of Vienna University, etc. He was a good linguist. And the interesting, so they established a language that did not exist at that time, and they said, one nation, one literature, one national language. It's a print language, print capitalism, Benedict Anderson. We will not invent a new language, we will choose a popular language, populism. The one that is spoken by the majority. It's the southern dialect. Now, most of the speakers of this dialect were living outside Habsburg Empire at that moment in the Ottoman Empire. So it's definitely an imperialist project. Why do we? This is a beautiful argument. Look, this is really a beautiful argument. And why not artificial language? Because any mixture, being a human product, would be worse than any popular dialect which are God's creations. That's a nice argument. And because Germans and Italians did it this way. So it's a belated nations complex. Now they are speaking about in these populist terms, but also in the pan-Slavistic verve, invention of tradition. This dialect is closest to the Old Slavic, which is, every dialect is close to its predecessors. And if you look at it this way, and because all Dubrovnik literature, Ragusa literature is written in it, literary canon, elitist, populist and elitist at the same time. And the whole agreement is addressed to a specialized professional group, to the writers in this language, which were mostly males at that moment. So, the majority of the speakers concerned were living outside of Habsburg Empire at that moment, and over 50, that's an estimate, but probably 60–70% of this population were illiterate anyway. So you have on one side populism and normativity based on written canon, which generates a group of specialists, a priestly caste, and of course you have this contradiction between elitism and populism. So So I would say that nation, the structure of nation, roughly speaking, is populism and acquisition of standard language gives you access to political sphere, to political life, to freedom and equality. But you have to submit yourself to the pastorale, la pastorale in Foucault's term, which is operated by a group of specialists. Now, in the identity community, it's hierarchical. It's normativity gives you distinction, and la pastorale, of course, remains. So so these were ideological paths. The ideological dimension of new nationalism, which can partly explain the role of literary intelligentsia in the destruction of Yugoslavia, which was catastrophic, and the diverging paths of identity communities and political constructions, though that such external hegemonic recognition and those that did not. And the great break with new populism is that they don't search hegemonic recognition anymore. They oppose to this European Union or other imperial constructions. Now let's look at the picture. These are the percentages got by the last at the last elections by different parties, European parties in the European Union that are called populist. With the exception of Fidesz, of the Hungarian Fidesz, and of Polish Law and Justice, and Movement 5 Stars in Italy, they don't have really much support. Their effect, their effectiveness, their impact is much stronger than their electoral results. They shape the discourse and policies of traditional parties. They practically dominate the public sphere and the parliamentary processes, even though with 3-4 exceptions they are not really strong. So
could you please give this, excuse me, this graph back for a moment? Thanks.
Yeah, so you see, really strong is Fidesz. Then Law and Justice in Poland, okay. Movimento 5 Stelle has to go into coalition. 5 Stars in Italy. Freedom Party in Austria is in the government, but they only got 26%. So their force, their real force is greater, they are stronger than their electoral desires. So there must be other factors, there must be other reasons, causes, that make them so strong. And that's what we will investigate further. My hypothesis is that there are supplementary causes for their strength, and they are crisis of the traditional parties, conservative and social democratic. Since the mid-70s, they all merged towards the center. Blurring of the traditional left-right polarization, universal centrism, and culturalization of social tensions and conflicts. No more political process, but culturalism, you know, identities, etc. So this is not new. Gramsci was writing anti-fascist dictatorship in Italy, and he said, with one-party system, political questions are disguised as cultural ones, and as such become insoluble. Now, what happened in Europe at the end of 20th century is that practically one-party system occurred through liberal processes. And we still have formal liberal democracy, but there are no real political options. We have one-party system, the same jargon, the same programs, the same governmental practices by center-right and by center-left. So that's this crisis for my generation started in '68, of course. you know, the catastrophic policy of the Communist Party of France, or the Euro-communism of Italian Communist Party. So social democracy moves towards the center, communist parties are marginalized. The 80s already show la pensée unique, in the political establishment, the unitary jargon and estrade mechanisms in politics. Habermas says that this estrade style of politics started in the early 20s in the United States, by the way. But nobody reads this part of his famous book on Öffentlichkeit. So, radical right appropriates social questions, embraces culturalist jargon, and turns it into politics. We have politicization, but from the right, from the extreme right. So, so this is a brilliant quotation from Viktor Orban. That's his program. He says, competition among nations. We have to be ready. There's global competition. But there is a more important race than this economic competition. That is to invent a type of state that is most capable of making a nation successful. And it's not a liberal state. Look at Singapore, China, India, Turkey, Russia. It's an illiberal democracy, a non-liberal system. A workfare state, what he says, of course, which means more exploitation, of course. And it's a real specific national particular approach in national interests. A new type of political construction. So that's what he mentions. New form, world competition, that means we need to have a new form of state, which will be not welfare, but workfare state, and non-liberal democracy. If we translate it into our quasi-theoretical language, it means world competition, all the semi-periphery, Hungary, Slovenia, Hungary, etc., post-socialist countries in the European Union, plus Portugal, Spain, Greece, and Italy, of course, southern Italy. Semi-periphery, new form of state, non-liberal democracy, Totalstaat. So, what are the? Yeah, I'm coming to my point. Now I'm introducing theoretical concepts, the historical materialist, actually. By the way,
it's so interesting that I have lost the notion of time.
Okay, but look. So, what we are witnessing is class recomposition of local bourgeoisies. It comes very late in Hungary. They've sold all the national wealth away already. But then, you know, there is a local bourgeoisie that wants to recompose itself, and class decomposition of the working people. This was, I'm translating into modern concepts Trotsky's analysis of Nazism, of German fascism. Yeah. So, what's the economic basis of this process? Non-competitive fractions of capital. That's Zonrettel in the 30s again. Bourgeois parliamentarism is no more an efficient form of bourgeois class domination. Georg Dimitrov. Rate of profits has to be re-established. The production of absolute surplus value, which means more exploitation, again, Zonrettel. So that's why we have those historical analogies with classical, with traditional historical fascism, but we should not take them. We should not close ourselves into this conceptual frame, because the situation is nowadays different. It's not decadent Europe in the 30s, it's global capitalism of the 21st century. And of course the decadence of the Euro-Atlantic capitalism. So we have no new forms of state intervention and extra economic constraint. I will finish now, only to show you. These are the real politics. The black ones are new type of state intervention. The blue ones are reactionary measures against working people, and the red ones are social measures. And you can see the difference between Poland and Hungary. Hungary is much more aggressive against the working people, working classes, much more pro-capital, pro-domestic capital, of course, while Poland, being a Christian government, has this traditional social feeling to a certain extent. And I will end with those figures, which shows you that those policies are successful according to the present neoliberal criteria of success. They have low debt to GDP ratio. If you see Poland 50%, Hungary 73%, look at Japan, look at Greece, look at Italy, look at Portugal, of course, look at the United States. Huh? So European Union average, they are below. So they are relatively successful in those terms. Yeah. So the problem, as I see, is this, and at the end. In classical capitalism, you had national economy, you have a homogenizing trend, you had households were more or less in the same position, which means national culture, a field of political confrontation, and basically social democratic policies everywhere in the center of capitalism and in the socialist world. Nowadays, you have another separation, no national economies, or national economies in a very restricted sense. There is a separation number 2, which separates the whole production processes from social conditions of their production. In classical capitalism, it's only the labor force, the labor power that is separated from the social conditions of production. Now you have the whole production processes. You have a textile factory in Slovenia, which was sometimes selling its products from Soviet Union to Macedonia. With the end of socialism, it becomes a subcontractor of Bosch factory, Bosch multinational. At certain moment, Bosch sees that they can no more compete with Pakistani and Malaysian textile produced in sweatshops, and they say, well, we cut you off. Flack! The whole region in Slovenia gets unemployed, crisis, no real answer. So that is, let's say, the social-economic scheme within the horizon of which new nationalisms occur. As a defensive strategy, which is successful according to present criteria, that means successful on the account of the people who work, who produce riches. Thank you.
Dobre rano. It's good to be here. It's actually my first time in Serbia. After all these years, I have never made it here, but it's time. So, ever since I fled Iron Curtain myself in 1977, and when I became a stateless refugee protected by the UN asylum system without national passport, I mistrusted and feared all checkpoints. Passports have been only as good as the right to pass through or dock at ports they guaranteed. Once upon a time, there has been a world without passports and borders. Our era multiplies unhealthy borders and homogenizing walls. So I imagine in this paper a time machine that takes me on a journey with changing identity papers, mapping discontents of closed and porous borders. A brief history of passports takes us to the biblical book of Nehemiah, year 450 BCE, when the Persian king Artaxerxes gives the prophet a letter requesting his safe passage through the territories beyond the rivers Euphrates to Judah, where he's tasked to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. That Jews once before inhabited Jerusalem, or that there stood the first and second Solomon temple, where Al-Aqsa and Dome of the Rock perch today, may be facts absent from today's Palestinian narratives about a Temple Mount. We find the erasure of historical Jews in history books taught at the West Bank and Gaza. And Palestinians, having no nation state of their own, travel with stateless passports if anyone would have them to visit. They move across Israeli checkpoints and borders with extra permits and for humanitarian reasons, to go to the hospital, for example. Most citizens in the former Soviet orbit needed such internal security police permits to even exit, and with an otherwise useless passport to go anywhere to the West. East Germans once could not go anywhere near the West, not even to former Yugoslavia, whose mountain borders to Austria were rather porous. In the year 1414, the King Henry V used to issue safe conduct letters to any person living on either side of the today's Brexit line. And to foreigners, he gave papers free of charge. And about 100 years later, the word passport begins to refer to travel documents authorized by the Privy Council. The very locution passport designates a passage through the maritime ports or through the gates of the city wall. Now, there is an important passport controversy during the French Revolution. The issue during the revolution has been the control of movement. And here the passport emerges as an instrument of omniscient authority. We today have inherited this tension between security of the state, and from it emerges the more decisive locution, the security state, and that tension with an individual freedom. The revolutionary passport debate of the French Revolution took place in the Legislative Assembly of January 1792. A commentator suggested that the opposing sides fought as if the very fate of the revolution hung on the outcome of the passport question. The statist position praised the passport system as an all-seeing eye of the nation that would survey the enemies of the people and transform French districts into a system of patriotic centers protecting national peace. The opposing position was with reference to the Constitution. Revolution started with the destruction of passports, and now it must secure freedom of movement even in the times of crisis. Jules Verne's novel Around the World in 80 Days, 1873, celebrates three movements of peoples liberated by political and technological progress, and it ridicules the uselessness of passports, only meant to bother honest men and facilitate flight of rascals. Similarly, Stephen Zweig praises the cosmopolitan global free movement prior to World War I, quoting from his autobiography. Nothing makes us more sensible of the immense relapse into which the world fell after the First World War than the restriction of man's freedom of movement and the diminution of his civil rights. Before 1914, the earth belonged to all. People went where they wished and stayed as long as they pleased. There were no permits, no visas, and it always gives me pleasure to astonish the young by telling them that before 1914, I traveled from Europe to India to America without passport and without ever having seen one. One embarked and alighted without questioning or being questioned. One did not have to fill out a single one of the many papers which are required today. The frontiers which, with their customs officers, police, and militia have become wire barriers thanks to the pathological suspicion of everybody against everybody else, were nothing but symbolic lines, which one crossed with as little thought as one crossed the meridian of Greenwich. End of quote. The British Nationality and Status Alien Act of 1914 created a modern passport, a single page folded in 8 and clamped together with a cardboard cover. In 1920, the League of Nations made passports uniformly blue. World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution created millions of stateless persons. The passports requirement did two things. First, it protected people without papers during the collapse of stable political powers. And secondly, it regulated domestic labor markets threatened by economic migration during Great Depression. Stateless persons could move across international border in search of new residence and work. In 1925 and 26, the League of Nations adopted an international passport standard with photo requirements, personal identifiers, and number of free pages for visas. Zweig recalls how the loss of his citizenship and passport after Hitler's 1938 Anschluss of Austria, and my own Jewish family in Slovakia was stripped of their right to domicile, citizenship, and my grandfather lost his medical practice, all under the most brutal anti-Jewish codex declared by Slovak state in 1939. My family secured then fake papers under a wartime Christian alias, a scrap of paper that required luck, cunning, and constant flight. Stateless Jews who survived the Holocaust had then no citizenship and no domicile anywhere in Europe. Whether they moved across all borders or became settlers, possessing no or fake travel documents, they were illegal in their places of birth as much as when they were smuggled under the British blockade to Palestine. The modern passport regime evolves from the right of safe passage guaranteed by the powerful and benevolent sovereign to the security apparatus designed for sorting out peoples into citizens and aliens, suspicious nomads, and safe nationals. The emergence of identity registries in late 19th century joins the 20th century metamorphosis of passports and produces a unique identification system called bétillonnage, in which everybody is potentially a criminal. Dubbed after Alphonse Bertillon, the architect of a new brand of police memory, these methods were developed by the Paris police, subsequently gave birth to numerous applied anthropometry systems in the civil and military spheres. Bertillon designed an incremental physical description system comprised of 4 areas. Anthropometry, a field he enriched with typological description of the ear, nose, and iris. Then an incremental detailed physical description method, which he dubbed portrait parlé, spoken portrait of the body and face. Third, photographic description, which he continually enhanced by defining and refining general protocol for face and profile views, in practice inventing the mugshot. And fourth, inventory, a precise mapping of all specific marks to be found on the body, scars, tattoos, moles, and so on. His methodology found a direct application in 1912 when the nomadic populations, Roma and Sinti, were required to carry a compulsory anthropometric report card. To rationalize civil registration and registry of mobility, police identification methods identified suspect categories of individuals branded as dangerous. Anarchists in 1980s, subversive nationalists and foreigners prior to 1914, foreigners at large who were required to carry an ID from 1917 onwards. Stigmatized and medicalized by anthropological identification grid, any suspect body was profiled with regard to morphological deviations from the norm. Stateless and nomadic persons, not just refugees, transgress the nation-state norms. They do not fit the bordered container and thus are profiled in identity registries. The arbitrariness of all border surfaces is in contradictory or extreme cases of applying of the system of bétillonnage. An example, Johan, a 1-year-old boy, appeared in July 2018 at the Phoenix Immigration Court. He had no familial and political protection of his country. This undocumented Honduran toddler refugee was detained at the US-Mexican borders and held apart from his family at an undisclosed concentration site for refugee children. The presiding judge was embarrassed to ask if the boy understood the deportation proceedings. I do not know who you would explain it to unless you think that a 1-year-old could learn immigration law, he told Johan's attorney. Johan indicated in the strongest terms that a 1-year-old is capable of knowing that his borders were violated to the core by the xenophobic walls of the secret and inhuman detention, he cried out hysterically and repeatedly asked for agua. Another case. One of the 12 boys rescued in July 2018 from the Tham Luang cave in northern Thailand was Adul Samon, a stateless orphan from Wa tribe known by headhunting. He escaped from Myanmar at the age of 6, having fled the drug violence of the Golden Triangle, as well as the poverty. In the next 8 years, Adul made it to the top of his English class. And that earned him a free tuition and lunch. A person without country, he was the first interpreter for the British divers who came to the rescue of all 12 wild boars on the soccer team who were stuck in the cave. He spoke fluently 5 languages: Burmese, Wa, English, Thai, and Mandarin. 3 of the boys, as well as their coach, were in Thailand as stateless refugees. There are almost 500,000, some estimate 3 million stateless persons in Thailand. 20% students in adult schools have no citizenship or passports. And so the soccer team was a placeholder for people without nation-state borders, and it afforded the stateless boys protection others receive through citizenship. After the rescue from the cave, Thailand rescued the stateless boys from homelessness and granted them all Thai citizenship. Case 3. Noam Trevor responds to a letter from the French ambassador criticizing him from congratulating Africa on France's World Cup victory in July 2012. The World Cup and the nation of the French opened an issue, quote, how best to refer to soccer players of African origin so as to honor both their heritage and their French status. In July 2012, France was debating French identities of soccer players of African origins on the team that won France the World Cup. What is the relationship between their heritage and their French status? Trevor's congratulation to Africa on winning the World Cup triggered not only a response from the French ambassador, but also widely on social media. For example, I read on the social media in Israel, one person saying, to all who celebrated the World Cup, Trevor know about French Africans playing for France. What he says about America applies to Israel too. We can be American Jews and celebrate Israel. We can be French Jewish, and we can be Moroccan and Russian Jewish and celebrate Israel as our Israel identity. And one day I hope we can also be Arabs and celebrate Israel identity. End of quote. So passport reduces the freedom of movement its creation promises because its power is underwritten by the security of internal and international borders. It strengthens the international security apparatus. The international passport system presupposes the power it is intended to project. Passport works only where the administrative resources of the state are already established by the right power inherited from the king, whose sacred right alone could grant the rights of safe passage. This right of border making is inherited by modern nation state. Neither the travel booklet assuring the veracity of identity signifiers, nor the checkpoint system administered as a police institution can diminish this inherent passport instability. The mobility makes the identity references of the passport vulnerable to forgeries, and the nation states become increasingly police border power containers. The dog containers used for detainees at Guantanamo or on the southern US border are thus the painless convex mirrors of this passport history. My PhD student Diana Coleman's dissertation on renditions and extraterritorial prisons at Guantanamo examines 8 prison memoirs. In one of them, Murat Kurnaz, a child born in Germany of Turkish guest workers, a legal resident, did not qualify for German citizenship. He was detained in Pakistan in 2001 at a random police sweep while traveling on the bus back home. He fit neither the nation state of his birth nor that of his parents, and at 19 he came to Pakistan to study Quran. He was without roots and yet exhibited allegiance to a suspect brand of religion, no arms, no links to terror groups, and nothing indicating he was on the way to join militants. His profile was that of a Turkish Muslim who had become more religious while living as part of a minority population in Germany, traveled to Pakistan after 9/11 to deepen his faith. He was arrested, shackled, held in numerous undisclosed locations, then sold to the United States for $3,000 and taken to Guantanamo and imprisoned there under duress for an undefined length of time. He describes the constant control over the bodies of the prisoners. Even shackled and subdued, their bodies were subject to continuous correction and assault. They were masked, deprived of sound, kicked, stomped on, positioned the body according to orders, barked. Positioning was wrong. At Guantanamo, the cages looked like dog runs, but were smaller than a regulation-sized dog run in Germany. The vanishing point of the passport history is what one commentator calls the archival promise of the biometric passport. History evolution of the international passport leads to an archival practice. Passport, as well as other ID documents, have always been a feature of the activity matching a person to a number through which the particulars of that person can be traced to other records. In the 1920s, the increased administrative reach of the federal US government produced a documentary regime of verification in which documents beget documents to produce official identities verified through an archival memory of the state. Even in countries where one had both international passports and checks at the national borders, passport inspectors did not always check passports. The biometric passports were launched in 2006. So it considers of only 3 types of biometric identification that are stored on a microchip: facial recognition, mandatory; fingerprint recognition, and iris recognition. Those 2 are optionals. Yet there is more biometric information in passport than what is stored on the chip. It specifies one's identity by name, signature, gender, and age, measurement of the face, other data containing one's identity, to regulation of work, taxation, government benefits, healthcare, and other governmental function. This information is given maximum security protection in accordance with current ideology, systems, and technologies of document security. Individual identity is thus defined as 1, machine-readable body measurements; 2, a set of personal data recorded in governmental and other public archives; and 3, mediated by a document owned and managed by the nation state. And here lies the archival promise of the late 19th century Bertrand. One can retrieve the individual instance from the huge quantity of instances contained within the archive and exchange of information between police departments and between states. The evolution of the passport and of the police archive converge as instruments of discipline and subordination. In the 19th century archive, the image captured the criminal, representing his identity within its frame. In the new digital space, the image captures the body independently of any such fixed identity. Criminality is thus an attribute that all bodies are prone to, and as a result, all bodies, not just those identified as criminals, are sized to be monitored and administered. The body in the digital archive exists as something that is potentially criminal, and therefore as something warranting continued surveillance. I take 5 minutes and finish. Some 30 years ago, I developed an existential critique of nationalism in which, against the backdrop of Central European experiences of '89, I brought together as allies Kierkegaard, Havel, and Habermas. I developed then an existential critique of nationalism by way of Kierkegaard's category of singular individual, in order to correct for Habermas's procedural and deliberative democracy, and also to root out nationalist motivation and identity formation. Let's see how to shorten it. But today there is a growing backlash to the idea that countries should privilege democracy over all else. And that movement, driven by perceptions of physical and demographic insecurity, insists that now identity will come first. As evidenced in the intractable Israeli-Palestinian conflict, borders do not perfectly align with populations. People move, identities shift or evolve. There is a breakdown of the 1960s informal consensus that is, if the requirement of democracy and national identity clash, the first should prevail. That did not mean abandoning national identity, but it did mean softening how it was understood and maintained. A recent study reveals that in countries where dueling national identities reached a compromise, democracy prevailed over identity. The 2018 nation-state addition to the Basic Law of Israel seems to point to a reverse trend. Nationalist backlash arises when identities are threatened or become insecure. Terrorism, perceived unevenness of birth rates, immigration. Can one be both nation-identified and democratic? What should take precedence under the conditions of threat? It is disingenuous to single out Israel with its shifting internal or external Israeli-Arab borders as an apartheid regime. This charge of being an apartheid regime either is true of every border drawn by modern nation-states and their global digital passport archive regimes, or the critique and the ensuing boycott movements are just screen memory, deflections from the biometric truth stored in the so-called free passports we all carry in our pockets. Some walls betray xenophobic fears, and other walls are containers. And even with the largely ceremonial nation-state law introduced in Israel, Israeli passports are neither safe in nor recognized by most Arab states, including the Iranian descendants of the Persian king. Israeli Jews are disallowed by their own government from going to the West Bank and Gaza, often using other passports to visit friends. And yet Israeli Arabs move across security walls and internal checkpoints without hindrance. This wall marks a non-existent two-state borders. It's like every nation-state border. The state of Israel has no internal apartheid. Arabs and Jews mingle freely everywhere in Israel, eat, work, study, dance, receive medical care, swim, travel in same spaces. Tel Aviv, indeed, is the Asian Mecca of all secular and religious transgressions, without moral police and without identity borders. An American artist, Gary Davis, created a world passport in 1954, an instance of practical cosmopolitanism. This rite of passage is issued by the World Service Authority to individuals who wish to be identified as citizens of the world, with an entitlement to human rights under the 1948 United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, rather than as citizens of a particular nation. When I became stateless in 1977, I was given this kind of passport, actually. It's the best and yet the most useless of all travel documents you can imagine. It is called the United Nations Refugee Travel Document. On its title page, it declared that while I was stateless and protected by the UN Convention for Refugees, the document holds no prejudice as to the countries of the holder's origin. The global non-national state travel document was only as good as the United Nations idea of global cosmopolitan citizenship it projected. I needed visa for every country, guaranteed income, and a round-trip ticket back to the country of my political asylum. Can earnest and virtuous singular individuals survive in our age of globalization? This could be the question with which Habermas might update his query posed to Kierkegaard in '87, on which I based my initial project. Can our humanity and planet survive without singularity, cultivating a life of earnest virtues? Has the non-religious appearance of singularity that does not proceed from adherence to a group or beliefs become suspect to religious congregations? These are all still open questions. There are thus two extreme vanishing points where these attempts at defining individuals by stabilizing them within certain nation-state borders break down. Breakdown number one: unprotected, stateless, refugee, rendered bodies without rights, citizenship, bodies that can be kidnapped, held, and shipped out at random. There's no more nation-state, no more anything. And breakdown number two: the non-existing or permeable, unguarded global borders of a political refugee with the UN travel document that declares holding no prejudice, whether nationalist or xenophobic, against the place of the holder's origin, and in that sense is totally useless. So I should end there.
Oh, well, thank you for both. Well, as Martin said, Dr. Yanyo, and I guess I could add in Shalom, Salam Alaikum. And I'm from Jamaica, so I'll also say how you all keeping. And thank you for showing up today. It's also striking that we have xenophobia, identity, new forms of nationalism, and there's an implicit performance of welcome, but paradoxical, because we're conducting, of course, this conversation in English in Serbia. And in a way, the fact that you enable us who are not native speakers of Serbian to be able to communicate with you is an act of generosity and welcome. So despite certain things that may be asserted, in the actual performance, there is also a thesis against xenophobia. Of course, it's paradoxical because the context is imperial, and we know about the global imperialism of English, but within that framework, we also know that these are ongoing negotiations, as we may say. A lot of what I have to speak about dovetails well with Rastko Močnik's talk, which I enjoyed very much. And you'll see some connections connected to, I could see why the three of us were put together. Before I begin though, I'd like to thank also Natalia Milisavljević. There is a little small reunion here because as I was sitting down, I realized that I was sitting next to Bill McBride, Natalia, we met at, and there's Martin, we met at Purdue. And Paget and I are connected to Brown, so I'm a bit of a link here. So thank you for that. Okay, the first thing I'd like to mention is that there's an age-old philosophical problem. And it's discussed, I'm teaching a course right now on global existentialisms from antiquity to the present. And the age-old problem is a problem between stability and change. Surya Aurobindo of India brings this up, Ali Shariati in Iran. This is brought up by Kierkegaard, it's brought up, it's all over the place. And this is the human struggle with the fact that we emerge, we're a point of differentiation, we're a point of change, but we're also frightened by that change. And we then seek stability. In fact, the very notion of state comes out of the notion of stasis, through which we look for stability. So we have this tension. We're a creature that wants to fly to the skies, but we could fall and break our butt. And so we want to have a cushion, we want stability, and that stability connects to notions of state. Now, the struggle with notion of states have also been a situation through which we have developed certain fallacies. Now, you notice right now I didn't say politically yet, but I'm just talking about level of stasis. One fallacy is that somewhere out there, whenever we have discontent with the state, we believe that there's somewhere out there, there's a group of people who got it right. And this is what informs some of the dynamics that undergird some of the issues today. Because the search, because I noticed the word identity is in the description, and the presupposition is that those people have it right internal to their identity. Whether they be working class, whether they be women, whether they be black, whether they be gay, indigenous, you could go down the line. So that's one fallacy. The problem, the reason it's a fallacy is because if they're a group of human beings, one of the things human beings are very good at is getting it wrong. So the presupposition that there's a group of people out there who have things right is already doomed for failure. The second fallacy is a fallacy that is premised upon force. And the second fallacy is you can achieve anything, absolutely anything, if you can gather a big enough crowd. And this one, of course, is this presupposition in just the mere number and force of the crowd, things will get done. Okay? Now, these two fallacies are fallacies that tend to infect the ideas in terms of every issue of political change. And although, and this is not to say that there is no room beyond those fallacies, but they pop up in very interesting ways, and they pop up because we make presuppositions that when we're talking about political change, we often impose upon our practices a notion of symmetry with how we talk about the concept of the right and the left. You see? So even if we're going to talk about certain dynamics that will pop up in the right and the left, the error we make is when we presuppose if they pop up, they're actually having the same logic. Okay? So it's very important to really articulate the distinction between the right. Since I'm looking at you, I'm using my left hand to refer to your right. My children do theater, so I have practice at this. And the left. Now, one error is that a lot of people, when they talk about the right and the left, fail to understand that although the initial concepts were arbitrary, it came out of French Parliament, the seating arrangements in French Parliament. The Republicanists were on the left, and the monarchists were on the right. Now, although this was an arbitrary designation, it was wonderfully psychoanalytical. Because as you know, the left is connected to the notion also of sinister, and all kinds of other fears. I'm sorry, the left. And the right is connected to words like recht, trouw, the whole idea of order, rule. So ironically, although it began as something arbitrary, it manifests itself in a logic that's wonderfully mythic. So if we're going to analyze the right and the left at a content level, I've argued in my writings, and this is going to be, since we're going to publish this, there's a written version, but I'm just speaking to save the time. We can make a distinction between the right and the left if we think about a basic response that human beings may have to crises, okay? Now, in a longer talk, I get into the logic of crises, but for now, let's just put it out there. Crises basically etymologically mean a decision must be made, okay? And the reason I think it's very important to start with the question of the moment and the response to the decision to be made is precisely because you do not have an in advance notion of how you could manifest yourself as the right or the left. See, the error we make is we look at these human phenomena in non-human terms, as if there's a fixed right and a fixed left. But a fluid right and a fluid left means that a today left can be manifest itself as a tomorrow's right. So what do I mean? Well, if we start with the idea of crisis, there's a classic right-wing response to crises. The simple, straightforward response on the right to crises is that the crisis emerges through a divergence from a period of security. So that means all right wings have a belief that there is somewhere to return to. And that return is always premised on the presupposition that there was a group of people who got it right. The problem is they're in the past. So if you could return to the past, you can now affirm having it right. Now, the initial version of returning to the past has implicit in it a logic of order. And so this is why all right wings make an assertion of law and order and security. And this is why, although it emerged, his ideas emerged during a period of crisis, this is Thomas Hobbes. The idea is that the presupposition for peace requires the elimination of dissent in order to preserve security. Now, if you're going to make a turn to the right for security, the logic of the right raises a very, very significant question. The question is always, how much are you going to give up for security? The more the right radicalizes that question, this is what Ortega y Gasset noticed in Revolt of the Masses. The more the right radicalizes it, eventually, if all you're left with is the idea of order and security, then logically speaking, the right made extreme becomes fascism. Okay, so that's the basic premise. The idea is that if you have to eliminate that which is a source of difference, you can articulate a consistent order through having a form of fixed identity. This is why the right, in its logic, is always having something to eliminate. And among the things the right has to eliminate, and this is now where I introduce this, is the very concept of politics. And this is because the political, by definition, requires the negotiation of power through difference. In effect, then, what the right seeks is the subordination of politics to rule. And as a consequence, then, all right wings then become a form of anti-politics. Okay? And this is why fascism in the end becomes attractive to the right. Now, when we come to left, this is where it gets tricky. Because the presupposition today is if you say liberal, you mean left. But as we know, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, a lot of these others, they emerged in a context in which liberalism had an ambivalent relationship to politics. In fact, if you go and look in the Anglo countries today, there are many people who call themselves political philosophers who do no political philosophy whatsoever. What they do is applied moral philosophy. And this is because politics requires contingency and power, two elements that liberalism has a difficulty dealing with. So liberalism only emerges as left only the extent to which liberalism does not want to get rid of certain civil liberties on the road to the right. And that's why it's relative to the right that's oriented by the willingness to eliminate civil liberties that liberalism is able to appear as a left. However, the basic premise of a left in the moment of crisis is that a return to the past is futile, because if you look at the past, the project in the past was dealing with the imperfections of the past. So in effect, what a left is the presupposition that each moment in history was an effort to make things better, not an achievement of things being made perfect. So that means the response to the present from a left logic has to be that there's an imperfection that is to be improved, but it cannot be improved through a return, which is why left-wingism tends to be future-oriented, okay? So once we get this question of the future-oriented notion of left-wingism, now we have a different issue. Because as we know, the left splits because it's a contingent element. There is the anarchic left. The anarchist left tends to be premised on a conception of liberties in which the state or stasis may be in the way. But then there's another kind of left. There's a left that's based on the concept of maturation and flourishing, and that left tends to be linked to classical models of political life. Because the idea is the organization of political life is to facilitate human capacities. This means that each human institution from that model of leftism is not closed, but open. And that means that a human institution, a set of human relations or negotiations of power, those relations must then something must be brought to them to make them fit or function within the expectations of human beings over different periods of history. Okay? Now, so that means in effect then, that although both are left, there's an intrinsic conflict between the anarchist left and the flourishing left. Okay? And this is not, I'm using this language on purpose because we tend to just throw out there the left and collapse the left into whatever group that we're used to within our societal framework representing the left. Now, here's where now we come into something very crucial. Because you see, that position means that each left and each right is always, are always dealing with unique historical circumstances. Okay? And here's where they divide. The right, because it has implicit in it the notion of a human nature, it will address a new historical circumstance without the notion of it being new. Because it has implicit in it the permanence of human behavior and action. The anarchist left starts from a presupposition, a priori, that the state or nature is a certain way, which means its philosophical anthropology actually collapses into the right. The other left, because it doesn't have a closed philosophical anthropology, actually sees the human being as a project in the making, which means it cannot appeal to an idea of a preordained outcome of the given moment. You see the difference there? Now, this is really crucial because this is now where we begin to deal with the mediations through which we are dealing with the crises today. Because you see, even when I bring up the question of the right as a movement into fascism, the error many people make today is if they impose the logic of the circumstances through which the fascism is produced as a recurring same, then the critic collapses into the old logic of the right. If we reject the notion of a recurring same, it means the fascism of today, although identifiable, is not identical to the fascism of before. Now we know this historically because if you look at past versions of fascism, they were premised upon a presupposition into the future in which they could announce security for 1,000 years. Previous fascisms had grandiose promises for the future. However, the fascism of today is very different for a variety of reasons. First, I think what was presented in the first talk was really on point, okay? That the actual capitalism at work is actually changing the actual context through which the social phenomena are produced. So if we are to think about it, what are those circumstances, okay? Well, I think we need to add two elements to the material conditions that were articulated. The first element is we need to add a mythopoetic element of what I call a theodicy of capitalism, okay? Now, theodicy is very old. We already know this. If you look at early Christianity, theodicy in a nutshell is how do you account for the omnipotence, the goodness, and the omniscience of God in the face of infelicity, injustice, or evil. And the two classic responses were to argue that the infinitude of God meant it was silly for us in our finitude to question God. So in other words, something's wrong with us, not God. The second version was that our free will is such that although God's wisdom endowed us with this, we screwed it up. So in both versions, the aspiration is for a perfect God. This is the one who got it right, the God, and the imperfections are us. Now, what's striking, and again, we have a short time, so I can't get into details, but the short version is this logic permeates a lot of Euro-modern thought. It's there in the political philosophy, It's there in varieties of conceptions of science at the level of meta theory. It's various. If you look at most American political philosophy, they're theodicies. They basically come out to demonstrate why ultimately underneath the grammar of American society is intrinsically just. So its infelicities are external. It's a similar logic that happens all over the place. What we often miss, though, is that there is a theodicy in capitalism. Because you see, early human communities had the concept of humanized markets. Capitalism emerged, Euro-modern capitalism, under the premise that the problem with markets is that they were too human. And as a consequence, then, there had to be a transformation into a complete logic of capitalism as a system that is ultimately divine if it can overcome the contradictions of that system. So you see the reverse of it. Marx pointed out the contradictions of capitalism. Capitalism has to say contradictions are external to it. Once we understand that logic, it means then the consistency of capitalism requires, as in theodicy, the radicalization of its capacity to commodify all that stands in its way. So if you think about what would function as external to capitalism, as the critic of capitalism, the classical historical examples would be, say, religion or theology, okay? In other words, the question is, God should be above capitalism. But we've already seen that capitalism has conquered that through the market commodification of religion. The other one is knowledge. The logic should be knowledge of capitalism. But we've already seen that subverted into the capital of knowledge. In other words, the market commodification of knowledge. As it moves its path from education to the ultimate path then is science, knowledge, but also instead of the state that manages capitalism, it has to be the market commodification of the state. You got it? So once we begin to see that there's a theodicy of capitalism, that is what was linked in as a shift from the classical model of capitalism to the transition into neoliberal capital. Okay? In other words, the new form of capitalism presented itself as a conclusion, a global triumph against all notions of contradictions of that system. So that's one part. That's the theodicy part. Now, the thing that we have to bear in mind is that in addition to the theodicy part, which is actually theological and religious, there are also two important historical developments. One of them is the population of our species. In other words, with 7 billion people on the planet, we have a smaller planet. The second one is the technologies of movement. Because if you know as a basic law of physics, if you can traverse a space quicker, the space becomes smaller. Well, our technologies have enabled us to go across the planet so quickly that we also live not only in a more populated planet, but a smaller planet. So if you took the logic of the first presentation and you add those, you could see the recipe for a very different condition through which you raise the philosophical anthropology of the right and the left. Okay? Now within that framework then, there's one last element. The last element is, you know the way I argue that capitalism was able to raise the question to the question of the market of, instead of that of the market. This happens also with a variety of other centrisms. And again, I don't have time to go into the details, but among the concepts that have been conquered in that way is the concept like modern. And when often when we talk about the modern, we're really talking about the Euro-modern. When in fact there are many kinds of modern, okay? The chief element I argue in the modern is that the single element of the modern is the modern, properly speaking, is a fundamentally left concept. And what I mean by that is that the modern, properly speaking, always asks the question of belonging to the future. But the belonging to the future creates a retroactive assessment of the present. And if the idea of belonging to the future is such that the future is precluded. That's an assertion of the past onto the future, which makes the future right-wing, and it collapses it out as a modern concept. If the future has contingency, and others have argued this, Hans Blumenberg have argued this, there are many theorists who have argued this. If it's a contingent open concept, it means that one belongs to the future as a condition of the possibility of the future. Do you see what I'm saying? So that means that the future becomes an actual point of praxis in the classical sense of an open activity premised on freedom. Now, here's where it comes in a very unusual way. The right, the neoliberal right and the neoconservative right, have hijacked the imaginative capacities to think the global. What has happened is that when people say global, they simply mean privatization. And this becomes a very serious issue, because what it in effect means is that it has developed a situation in which many on the left have become anti-globalists because they've defined it as privatization. You see what I'm getting at? And this leads to a serious additional problem, because not only do you have a left that's anti-globalism, you also have a left that is linked into another, that is bought into the logic of the right-wing transformation of the concept of power. So if you follow the Hobbesian line, the entire discourse about power and globality have become about privatization and coercion. And those are the features that we have of the contemporary fascism. Not only do you have privatization and coercion, but you have a situation where the right actually embraces power if power is coercive, which means that they're willing to take on the mantra of rule. And here's the crucial thing. Rule, governing, and politics are not the same thing. You see? And this is why we have, for instance, an anti-sovereignty left in the world today, because they've collapsed sovereignty into the Hobbesian right-wing model of sovereignty. However, if one thinks about globalism beyond privatization and beyond coercion, then we need to understand what power is in its other capacity. In other words, a lot of the critiques of power do not define power because they've already deferred power to the right. So you have a right that embraces coercive power, and you have a left that's allergic to power. However, if we define power as the ability to make things happen with access to the conditions of its possibility, then that means that the ability to make things happen could be the creative construction of alternatives. But those have to be made concrete in the form of power and institutions. So once we understand this, we begin to see then that a task that's needed in this unique situation is to understand that the right is postmodern in the sense that that right tends to take on all of the mantras of the anti-responsibility for the future, but it also takes on a lot of the cliches of postmodernism, anti-essentialism, etc. You could see this in the American right, because the American right claims to be anti-essentialist. If you look at the logic that's used under the Trump administration, it undermines the capacities of truth. It collapses them into opinion and doxa. It has the form of equivocation notions of identity. It has all the elements of postmodernism. But the problem, I would argue, is a fundamental of the problem of the left through a failure to deal with the mechanisms and implications of global power. And to conclude, because we have limited time, if we look at the efforts to break up the European Union, to destroy the various forms of federalism, including what happened here in terms of Yugoslavia, the logic of the right is the idea that any globalism would actually represent a threat to privatized capital. Only privatized capital can be global. However, if we think about the idea of global labor, if we think about the idea of global migration, which connects to Martin's point, it means you'll have a world without borders, a world without passports, a world in which the movement of labor would be such that the question of even if you have mixed economies, the task would not be how do you make labor vulnerable, because that of course means you can extract the wealth from labor. The issue would be, in a world of global movement, how do you retain labor, because labor can go wherever there are opportunities, you see? And that is the ultimate threat that labor has for the right-wing conception of globalism and capital. This understanding, although people may treat it as utopic, what they fail to understand is at the level of technologies and at many other levels already there's the infrastructure for that form of global movement. But the big problem is that we're using 19th century models of the organization of states when we have 21st century problems through which to address the global situation today. The last, very last part to put is if you add to this, we have to deal with something very unique on the right and on fascism today that's different from the past. In the past, because there was a presupposition of belonging to a future, all forms of right imagined themselves, in effect, as being ancestors. Because to be ancestors, you must have descendants. If you look at the contemporary kleptocracy, plutocracy, and structure of models of power today, there is no investment in the idea of having descendants. And particularly acute is how the stand is on climate change. That means we're dealing right now with a form of ruling right with actually no interest in being ancestors because of a rejection of descendants, which means that we're on new terrain because we're actually dealing with a form of nihilism through which we cannot use the ordinary logic of rationality and reason in terms of the harms they will conduct. And that is why the right today functions in terms of immediate payoffs. And immediate payoffs sometimes are as simple as the logic of ressentiment. Put differently, the logic is, if I cannot have, then I can be satisfied with going to sleep knowing others also do not.